The cold Montana wind whipped across the plains as Forrest Finley pulled his duster tighter around his broad shoulders, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his chestnut mare with familiar ease. 12 long years had carved lines into his once smooth face, his eyes squinting against the dying sun as Blackwater Creek came into view, a place he'd sworn never to return to until the letter had arrived bearing news he couldn't ignore. The year was 1878, and the West was changing. Railroad tracks carved through territories once wild and untamed, bringing with them the promise of civilization and the death of the frontier Forrest had come to love. But none of that mattered now, not when Faith Vallance might still be waiting in the town that had seen their young love bloom and wither before it had truly begun. As the buildings of Blackwater Creek rose on the horizon, memories flooded back her golden hair catching the sunlight, her laughter like spring water over stones, the promises they'd made under a canopy of stars before life had torn them apart. Faith had been just 18 when he'd left, barely a woman. He'd been 21, full of dreams and the reckless courage of youth. Now, at 33, he returned a different man, hardened by years of cattle drives, gunfights, and solitude. The town had grown since he'd last seen it. New storefronts lined the main street, and a proper church steeple rose where once only a small wooden chapel had stood. Forrest tied his horse outside the saloon, adjusting his gun belt before pushing through the batwing doors. The familiar smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies greeted him, a scent that had become more home to him than any four walls ever could. "Whiskey," he told the bartender, dropping a coin on the scarred wooden surface. "And information." The bartender, a burly man with mutton chops and suspicious eyes, slid a glass toward him. "Information costs more than whiskey in these parts." Forrest slid another coin across. "I'm looking for someone. Faith Vallance." The bartender's expression changed, something like pity crossing his features. "The Vallance place is about 3 miles east of town, but Mr. He hesitated, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. "You might want to know what you're riding into." Forrest knocked back his whiskey, the liquor burning a familiar path down his throat. "I appreciate the concern." Outside, the air had grown colder as dust settled over the town. Forrest mounted his horse, thoughts racing as he guided her toward the eastern trail. The letter that had reached him in Colorado had been sparse with details only that Faith needed help, and there was no one else to turn to. It bore the signature of her younger sister, Florence, who'd been just a child when Forrest had left. The Vallance homestead came into view as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. It looked smaller than he remembered, the barn listing slightly to one side, the white paint on the house peeling and gray. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the chill in the air. Something was wrong. Forrest dismounted, tying his horse to the fence post before approaching the house. His spurs jangled with each step, announcing his presence to whoever might be listening. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his revolver. "Hello," he called, climbing the porch steps. "Anyone home?" The door creaked open at his knock, revealing a dimly lit interior. A figure sat motionless in a rocking chair by the cold hearth, a blanket draped over slender shoulders. "Faith?" Forrest's voice was barely a whisper now. The figure turned, and Forrest felt his heart stop. It was her those same blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for 12 years. But they were different now, hollow, surrounded by dark circles in a face too thin, too pale. Her once vibrant golden hair hung limp around her shoulders. "Forrest?" Her voice cracked, disbelief coloring the single word. "Is it really you?" He stepped into the house, removing his hat as he approached her. "It's me, Faith. I got your sister's letter." Faith's eyes clouded with confusion. "Florence? But she—" She stopped, shaking her head as if to clear it. "I've been sick. The fever, it makes things fuzzy sometimes." Forrest knelt beside her chair, noticing how she trembled despite the blanket. Without thinking, he placed a hand on her forehead. She was burning up. "Where's Florence?" he asked, looking around the empty house. "The letter said you needed help." Faith's gaze drifted to the window, where the last light of day was fading. "Florence is gone, Forrest. They're all gone. Pa died 3 winters ago. Florence took ill last spring." Her voice broke. "I buried her myself." The realization hit Forrest like a physical blow. Then who sent me the letter? Faith shook her head again, confusion evident. I don't know about any letter. Forrest rose, moving to stoke the dead fire. Questions could wait. Faith needed warmth, medicine, food, things he could provide now. As the kindling caught, casting dancing shadows across the room, he turned back to find Faith watching him, something like wonder in her fevered eyes. I dreamed of you coming back, she whispered. For years I dreamed it. Forrest felt a tightness in his chest he hadn't experienced in a long time. I'm here now, he said simply, unsure what else to offer. He helped her closer to the fire, noticing how light she felt in his arms, how fragile. This wasn't how he'd imagined their reunion during those long, lonely nights on the trail. In his mind, she'd always been as vibrant and strong as the day he'd left. Not this ghost of herself, ravaged by illness and solitude. When did you get sick? He asked, finding a pot to heat water for tea. 2 weeks ago, maybe more. The days blur together. She pulled the blanket tighter. I thought I was getting better, but then the fever came back worse. Forrest rummaged through the kitchen, finding a pitifully bare pantry. A few potatoes, some dried beans, a bit of salt pork, not enough to nurse anyone back to health. He'd need to hunt tomorrow, bring back fresh meat. As he prepared a simple broth, Faith watched him with those haunting eyes. Why did you come back, Forrest, after all this time? He stirred the pot, choosing his words carefully. The letter said you needed help, that there was no one else. But who would send it? She frowned, wincing as if the movement caused her pain. I don't know, Forrest admitted, but I'm glad they did. They fell into silence as he finished preparing the broth, pouring it into a chipped bowl he found in a cupboard. He helped her hold it, her hands too weak and shaky to manage alone. As she sipped slowly, color seemed to return to her cheeks, a spark reigniting in those blue eyes. You look different, she said after a while. Harder. Forrest nodded, knowing it was true. 12 years is a long time. Did you find what you were looking for? There was no accusation in her voice, only genuine curiosity. Had he? Forrest had left seeking adventure, fortune, a life beyond the confines of Blackwater Creek. He'd found the adventure, certainly fought in range wars, drove cattle from Texas to Montana, even panned for gold in California. But fortune had proved elusive, and the freedom he'd craved had often felt more like rootlessness. Parts of it, he answered honestly. Not all. Faith set down the bowl, her strength seemingly spent by the small meal and conversation. I should rest, she murmured, eyes already drooping. Forrest helped her to the bedroom, noting the neatly made bed, a stark contrast to the rest of the neglected house. He pulled back the quilt, a handmade piece he recognized from years ago. Faith sank onto the mattress with a sigh. Will you be here when I wake up? She asked, suddenly sounding younger, vulnerable in a way that squeezed his heart. I'll be here, he promised, drawing the quilt over her. On impulse, he reached for his hat, still clutched in one hand, and placed it gently beside her pillow. So, you know it's not a dream. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, before her eyes closed completely. Forrest stood watching her for a moment, noting the rise and fall of her chest, the strands of gold hair spread across the pillow. Then he quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. He spent the night in a chair by the fire, his mind whirling with questions. Who had sent that letter, signed with the name of a dead woman? Why now, after all these years? And what would happen when Faith was well again? Morning brought thin sunlight streaming through dirty windows. Forrest had already been up for hours, repairing what he could around the house, gathering eggs from the few chickens that still scratched in the yard, and hunting a rabbit for their breakfast. He was skinning his catch when he heard the bedroom door open. Faith stood in the doorway, his hat clutched in one hand, her other braced against the frame for support. She looked better, still too thin, still pale, but her eyes were clearer. You're really here, she said, holding up his hat as evidence. I thought perhaps I'd dreamed it all. Forrest set aside his knife and stood. How are you feeling? Stronger. She took a tentative step forward. The fever broke during the night. He moved to help her to a chair, noting how she leaned into his support without hesitation, as if they hadn't spent 12 years apart, as if he hadn't broken her heart when he left. Over breakfast rabbit stew and the last of the cornbread he'd found, Faith began to fill in the years he'd missed. Her father had struggled after Forrest left, the ranch slowly failing without enough hands to work it. They'd sold off land piece by piece until only the house and a few acres remained. Florence had married young to a man passing through a mistake, as it turned out. He'd abandoned her with a baby on the way, and both mother and child had died in childbirth. After that, it was just me and Pa, Faith said, her voice steady despite the tragedy she recounted. He never recovered from losing Florence. His heart gave out 3 winters ago. And you've been alone ever since? Forrest couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. Why didn't you leave? Go to town? Find work? Or what, Forrest? Marry? Her gaze was direct now, challenging. I had offers, turned them all down. The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. She'd waited for him, even after it became clear he wasn't coming back. Faith, She shook her head, cutting him off. It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. She pushed herself up from the table, steadier than before, but still weak. What matters is figuring out who sent you that letter, and why. Forrest watched her move to the window, sunlight illuminating the gold still present in her hair, despite the dullness illness had brought. The handwriting, did it look like Florence's? Faith turned, surprise evident on her face. You kept Florence's letters? Just one, he admitted. The truth was more complicated. He'd kept all of Faith's letters, reading them until the paper grew thin and the ink faded. Florence had written only once, shortly after he left, a childish scrawl begging him to come back because her sister cried every night. Faith considered this. I have some of her things in a trunk. We could compare the writing. The trunk yielded letters, a diary, even some school exercises. Comparing them to the letter Forrest had received, the difference was immediately apparent. The handwriting in the mysterious letter was a skilled forgery similar enough to pass a casual inspection, but clearly different upon closer examination. Someone went to a lot of trouble, Forrest mused, running a hand through his hair. But who would know about Florence? About us? Faith's expression darkened. Victor Hargrove. The name hit Forrest like a physical blow. Victor Hargrove, the wealthy rancher, who'd owned half the county when Forrest left, and probably more now. The man who'd tried to court Faith before Forrest had even looked her way. Despite being 15 years her senior, the man who'd made it clear that a poor cowhand like Forrest Finley would never be good enough for her. Hargrove? Forrest's hand instinctively moved to his gun. What does he have to do with this? Faith sat heavily on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking exhausted again. Everything. After Pa died, he offered to buy our land. When I refused, things started happening. Cattle went missing. Our well was fouled. Strange men would ride by, watching the house. Anger rose in Forrest's chest, hot and familiar. He was trying to scare you off your own land? Faith nodded. It worked on others. The Johnsons, the Murrays, they all sold to him eventually. But this was my home. Her voice broke slightly. Our home. I couldn't just give it up. Forrest crossed to her, kneeling so they were eye to eye. You think Hargrove sent that letter to bring me here? Why would he do that? I don't know, Faith admitted, meeting his gaze. Maybe he thought you'd convince me to sell. Maybe he thought... She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Thought what? That I'd leave with you, she finished quietly. That I'd finally give up this place if it meant being with you again. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Forrest stood, needing distance to think clearly. Victor Hargrove was not a man to cross lightly. If he was behind this, there was more to his plan than met the eye. We need to find out what he's up to, Forrest said finally. But first, you need to rest more, regain your strength. Faith looked ready to argue, but nodded instead, acknowledging the wisdom of his words. And you? What will you do? Forrest looked around the neglected homestead, mentally cataloging all that needed repair. I'll start by fixing this place up a bit, then maybe ride into town, ask some questions. Be careful, Faith warned. Hargrove has most of the town in his pocket now. Forrest's smile was grim. I've faced worse odds. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Forrest rose at dawn, tending to the few animals, hunting, and making repairs around the property. Faith grew stronger each day, soon able to help with cooking and lighter chores. They fell into an easy rhythm, as if the years apart had been merely days. In the evenings they sat by the fire, sharing stories of the years between. Forrest told her of cattle drives in Texas, of the mountains in Colorado, of the characters he'd met along the way. Faith spoke of her life in Blackwater Creek, the changes in the town, the people who'd come and gone, the small joys she'd found despite her isolation. What neither spoke of was the past. They shared the young love that had blossomed one summer, the plans they'd made, the promises broken when Forrest had chosen the open road over a life with Faith. On the fourth day, Forrest rode into town. Blackwater Creek looked different in daylight, busier, more prosperous than he'd first thought. New buildings had sprung up, including a grand hotel at the end of the main street with Hargrove House emblazoned across its facade in the gold letters. His first stop was the general store, where he purchased supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, and medicine for Faith. The storekeeper, a nervous man named Parker, eyed him suspiciously as he listed his needs. "You staying out at the Vallance place?" Parker asked, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. Forrest nodded, not offering more information. "Folks were starting to wonder about Miss Vallance," Parker continued, seemingly unable to contain his curiosity. "Hasn't been to town in weeks. Some thought she might have finally given up, moved on." "She's been ill," Forrest said shortly. "She's recovering now." Parker's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Well, that's good news. Shame about her holding on to that worthless piece of land, though. Mr. Hargrove has offered her a fair price, more than fair from what I hear." Forrest leaned on the counter, his posture casual but his eyes hard. "That land belongs to the Vallance family, has for 30 years. Parker swallowed, suddenly finding the coffee beans fascinating. Of course. Just saying it might be better for a woman alone, you understand? Safer." "She's not alone anymore," Forrest said, his voice low and steady. The storekeeper's eyes widened at the implication. "No, I suppose she isn't." "That'll be $3.45 for everything." Forrest paid and gathered his purchases, aware of the eyes following him as he left the store. Word would spread quickly that Faith Vallance had a man staying with her, a gunslinger by the look of him. Good. Let Hargrove know he wasn't dealing with a defenseless woman anymore. His next stop was the saloon, where loose tongues and strong drink often yielded information. He ordered whiskey and found a corner table with a view of both the door and the bar. It didn't take long for curiosity to overcome caution. A weathered cowboy with a gray mustache approached his table. "Mind if I join you, stranger?" Don't often see new faces in Blackwater Creek these days. Forrest gestured to the empty chair. "Be my guest." The man sat, extending a calloused hand. "Frank Miller, run a small spread north of town." "Forrest Finley." He shook the offered hand. "Just passing through." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. "Finley? That name sounds familiar." Forrest sipped his whiskey, non-committal. "Common enough name." "Maybe so." Miller leaned back, studying him. "But I remember a young cowhand by that name who worked for old James Vallance years back. Broke his daughter's heart when he lit out for parts unknown." So his reputation had survived the years. Forrest met the older man's gaze steadily. "People change, Mr. Miller. Sometimes they come back to make things right." A slow smile spread across Miller's face. "So they do. Glad to hear it. That girl's had more than her share of troubles." He lowered his voice. "Especially with Hargrove breathing down her neck about that land." "What's so special about her property?" Forrest asked, sensing Miller might be an ally. "It's not particularly good grazing land, and too small for a proper ranch now." Miller glanced around before leaning closer. "Railroad's coming through, Mr. Finley. Tracks being laid 20 miles south right now. But there's talk of a spur line to Blackwater Creek. The most direct route would cut right through the Vallance property." Understanding dawned. If Hargrove controlled that land, he'd control where the railroad could build, and could demand any price he wanted for the right-of-way. "How long before the railroad reaches this area?" Forrest asked. 6 months, maybe less. Hargrove's been buying up land for the past 2 years, preparing. The Vallance place is the last piece he needs." Forrest knocked back the rest of his whiskey. "Appreciate the information, Mr. Miller." The older man nodded. "Word of advice, son, watch your back. Hargrove doesn't take kindly to interference, and he's got hired guns now. Mean ones." As if summoned by the warning, the saloon doors swung open and 3 men entered. They moved with the easy confidence of predators, gun belts worn low, eyes scanning the room until they settled on Forrest. "Speaking of the devil's men," Miller muttered, rising quickly. "Good luck to you, Finley." The lead gunman approached as Miller retreated, tall and lean, with a puckered scar running from his left eye to his jawline. He stopped before Forrest's table, thumbs hooked in his belt. "You'd be Finley," he stated, voice raspy like sand on stone. "Boss wants a word." Forrest remained seated, one hand casually near his revolver. "Your boss can find me if he wants to talk." The scarred man's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "That ain't how it works around here, cowboy. When Hargrove calls, you answer." "Times change," Forrest replied evenly. "Give Hargrove a message for me. The Vallance land isn't for sale, not now, not ever." The gunman's hand twitched toward his weapon, but he caught himself, eyes flicking to Forrest's own hand, poised near his holster. A calculating look crossed his face. "Have it your way," he said finally. "But this ain't over. Boss gets what he wants in the end." "Always does." Forrest watched the 3 men retreat to the bar, their eyes never leaving him as he finished his drink and stood to leave. The message had been delivered, the battle lines drawn. Victor Hargrove now knew that Faith Vallance was no longer alone and unprotected. The ride back to the homestead gave Forrest time to think. The railroad explained Hargrove's interest in the land, but not the mysterious letter that had brought Forrest back to Blackwater Creek. If Hargrove wanted Faith to sell, why bring in the man she'd once loved? It didn't make sense, unless Hargrove knew something Forrest didn't. Faith was waiting on the porch when he returned, her hair gleaming in the late afternoon sun. She looked better than she had the morning color in her cheeks, strength in the way she stood. Something in Forrest's chest tightened at the sight of her. "You were gone a long time," she said as he dismounted. "I was beginning to worry." Forrest unloaded the supplies, handing her a package wrapped in brown paper. "Got you something." Faith unwrapped it, revealing a length of blue ribbon, the same shade as her eyes. A small thing, frivolous perhaps, but the smile that lit her face was worth every penny. "It's beautiful," she said, running the satin between her fingers. "Thank you." Inside, as Faith put away the supplies, Forrest recounted his conversation with Miller and the encounter with Hargrove's men. Her face grew serious as he explained about the railroad. "That explains a lot," she said, sitting at the kitchen table. "The increased pressure, the sabotage. He's running out of time." "Faith." Forrest sat across from her, covering her hand with his own. "This is going to get dangerous. Hargrove won't stop until he gets what he wants." Her fingers turned to grip his, surprising him with their strength. "This land is all I have left, Forrest. All that's left of my family, of our dreams." She hesitated, then added softly, "Of us." The words hung between them, laden with meaning. This land had been meant for them once a place to build a life together, to raise children, to grow old side by side, dreams that had died the day Forrest rode away. "We need to find out who sent that letter," he said, avoiding the unspoken question in her eyes. "It's the key to understanding what's really happening here." Faith withdrew her hand slowly. "There's someone who might know. Martha Hayes. She was Florence's friend, worked as a maid at Hargrove House for a time. If anyone knows what Hargrove is planning, it might be her. Where can we find her?" "She lives on the edge of town with her son. Her husband was killed in a ranch accident 2 years ago, one of Hargrove's properties." Forrest nodded, a plan forming. "Tomorrow, we'll ride into town together. You can visit Martha while I make some inquiries of my own." Faith's eyes widened. "Together? But I haven't left the property in weeks. I'm not sure." "It's time people saw you're back on your feet," Forrest said firmly, "and that you're not alone anymore." Something flashed in Faith's eyes, hope, perhaps, or something deeper. "All right," she agreed. "Tomorrow?" That night, as they sat by the fire, the conversation turned to memories their shared past, the summer they'd fallen in love, the dreams they'd had before life pulled them in different directions. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" Faith asked, her voice soft in the firelit room. If you'd stayed? Forrest stared into the flames, unable to meet her gaze. More than I care to admit. And do you regret it? Leaving? The question he'd been dreading. Forrest took a deep breath, knowing she deserved honesty. I regret hurting you. I regret missing all these years. But at the time, he trailed off, searching for the right words. You needed to go, Faith finished for him. I understand that now, better than I did then. We were so young. Forrest finally looked at her, taking in the woman she'd become stronger, more self-possessed than the girl he'd left behind, yet still with that same light in her eyes that had captured his heart all those years ago. Faith, A gunshot cracked through the night, the bullet splintering the window frame inches from Forrest's head. Without thinking, he lunged across the space between them, tackling Faith to the floor as more shots followed. Stay down, he ordered, drawing his revolver and crawling to the window. Outside, he could make out shadowy figures moving among the trees at the edge of the property. Forrest Finley, a voice called from the darkness. That was just a warning. Next time, we won't miss. What do you want? Forrest shouted back, keeping low. Tell the Vallance woman she has 1 week to accept Mr. Hargrove's offer. 1 week, or we burn this place to the ground with both of you in it. More gunshots punctuated the threat, bullets thudding into the walls of the house. Then the sound of galloping hooves as the attackers retreated into the night. Forrest waited until he was certain they were gone before turning to Faith, still huddled on the floor. Are you hurt? She shook her head, her face pale in the firelight. No, but this is new. Hargrove's men have threatened before, damaged property, but they've never shot at the house. Never threatened my life directly. Forrest helped her to her feet, his mind racing. Things are escalating. The railroad must be closer than Miller thought. Faith moved to the broken window, staring out into the darkness. What are we going to do, Forrest? I won't sell to Hargrove, not even if it costs me my life. But I can't ask you to stay and risk yours. Forrest joined her at the window, his hand finding hers in the darkness. You're not asking? I'm choosing. He squeezed her fingers gently. We'll figure this out together. Faith turned to him, moonlight silvering the tears on her cheeks. Why? After all this time, all these years apart, why risk everything for me now? Forrest reached up, brushing a tear away with his thumb. The answer was simple, had always been simple, even when he'd been too young and foolish to realize it. Because I never stopped loving you, he said quietly. Not for a single day. Faith's breath caught, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. Finding none, she leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a kiss that bridged the 12 years between them, healing old wounds and creating something new from the ashes of what had been. When they parted, Faith rested her forehead against his chest, her voice muffled. I never stopped loving you either, even when I wanted to, even when it would have been easier. Forrest held her close, making a silent vow that nothing not Victor Hargrove, not hired guns, not even the ghosts of his own past mistakes would take her from him again. Morning brought a new determination. They boarded up the broken window, cleaned up the glass, and prepared for their trip into town. Faith wore her best dress, faded but still pretty. The blue ribbon Forrest had bought her tied in her hair. Forrest cleaned his guns, checking and rechecking the ammunition. We should split up once we reach town, Faith said as they mounted their horses. I'll visit Martha while you gather what information you can. Forrest nodded, though he didn't like the idea of leaving her alone. Meet back at the general store at noon. Don't go anywhere alone. The ride to Blackwater Creek was tense, both of them scanning the landscape for any sign of Hargrove's men. But the trail remained clear, and they reached town without incident. They parted at the edge of Main Street, Faith turning her horse toward the cluster of small houses where Martha Hayes lived. Forrest watched her go, resisting the urge to follow. She'd survived 12 years without his protection. She could handle a morning visit to a friend. His first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent a message to an old friend in the U.S. Marshal's office. If things went badly with Hargrove, it wouldn't hurt to have the law on their side. Next, he visited the bank, making inquiries about property values and railroad interests in the area. The banker, a nervous man named Ellis, grew increasingly uncomfortable as Forrest's questions became more pointed. Mr. Finley, I really couldn't say what the railroad's intentions are regarding Blackwater Creek, Ellis insisted, mopping his brow with a handkerchief. These matters are highly confidential. Forrest leaned across the desk, his voice low. Confidential enough that Victor Hargrove is willing to threaten a woman's life to get her land? Ellis paled. I don't know what you're implying, sir, but I think you do, Forrest interrupted. I think everyone in this town knows exactly what Hargrove is doing, and they're all too scared to stop him. The banker glanced nervously at the door. Please, Mr. Finley, if he hears we've been discussing his affairs— What affairs? A new voice interjected. Forrest turned to find himself face to face with Victor Hargrove himself. The years had not been kind to the rancher. His once powerful frame had thickened with age and indulgence, his face flushed with the telltale signs of a man who drank too much. But his eyes were as cold and calculating as Forrest remembered. Hargrove, Forrest acknowledged, straightening to his full height. I was just asking about the railroad coming to Blackwater Creek. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. Forrest Finley. The prodigal returns at last. He dismissed the banker with a wave of his hand. Leave us, Ellis. The banker scurried out, relief evident on his face. Hargrove closed the door behind him, then turned to face Forrest. 12 years, Hargrove mused, circling Forrest like a predator. 12 years, and now you suddenly appear, just when Faith Vallance is at her most vulnerable. Curious timing, wouldn't you say? Forrest kept his expression neutral. I go where I'm needed. And who determined you were needed? Hargrove countered. Not Faith, certainly. The woman's too proud to ask for help, even when she's dying on that worthless piece of land. She's not dying, Forrest said evenly, and that land isn't worthless not with the railroad coming. A flash of something surprise, perhaps, or respect crossed Hargrove's face. So, you've figured that much out. Clever boy. But do you understand what you're up against? This isn't just about a piece of land, Finley. It's about the future of Blackwater Creek, my future. And Faith's future means nothing? Hargrove's laugh was short and harsh. Faith Vallance had her chance at a future. She could have married me years ago, been mistress of the finest house in the county. Instead, she chose to pine after a man who abandoned her without a backward glance. The words struck home, but Forrest didn't flinch. The past is done. I'm here now, and Faith isn't selling her land. Not to you, not to anyone. Hargrove's face darkened. That's where you're wrong, boy. She will sell, one way or another. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Did you really think I'd let some washed-up gunslinger stand in my way? I own this town, Finley, the law, the businesses, even the church all mine. Not Faith, Forrest said quietly. You never owned her. Something ugly twisted Hargrove's features. No, but I will. When she has nothing left, not her land, not her pride, not even you to protect her, she'll come crawling to me. He stepped back, adjusting his expensive coat. You have 1 week to convince her to sell. After that, I can't guarantee your safety or hers. With that, he turned and strode from the bank, leaving Forrest alone with the echo of his threat. Meanwhile, Faith had found Martha Hayes hanging laundry behind her modest home. The younger woman nearly dropped her basket when she saw Faith approaching. Faith Vallance! Martha exclaimed, rushing forward to embrace her. Lord above, it's good to see you up and about. We all feared the worst when you stopped coming to town. Faith returned the hug, surprised by the genuine warmth. I've been ill, but I'm better now, and I have help at the ranch. Martha's eyes widened. So the rumors are true? Forrest Finley has returned? Faith nodded, following Martha into the small house where 5-year-old Thomas Hayes played with wooden blocks on the floor. Yes, though I'm not entirely sure why or how. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. Over coffee, Faith explained about the mysterious letter signed in Florence's name. Martha listened, her expression growing increasingly troubled. Florence has been gone over a year, she said, shaking her head. Who would do such a thing? That's what I'm trying to figure out, Faith replied. I thought, since you worked at Hargrove House. Martha glanced nervously at her son, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. I did hear things, Faith. Things I shouldn't have. Mr. Hargrove has been obsessed with your land for years, more so recently, with the railroad plans. Did you ever hear him mention Forrest, or see any letters being sent? Martha bit her lip, clearly conflicted. Not exactly, but about 2 months ago, I was cleaning Mr. Hargrove's study when I overheard him talking with that gunman he hired, Scar, they call him. They were discussing some plan involving you, and a man from your past. Faith's heart raced. What kind of plan? I couldn't hear everything, Martha admitted, but Hargrove said something about using your feelings against you, that you'd never sell to him. But you might sell to... She stopped, looking uncomfortable. To Forrest, Faith finished. He thought I'd sell if Forrest asked me to. Martha nodded. I think so. But there was more to it. Something about making sure neither of you left Blackwater Creek alive once the deed was signed. A chill ran through Faith. He planned to kill us both. Faith, you need to leave, Martha urged, gripping her hand. Take Forrest and go, tonight. Hargrove won't stop until he gets what he wants. Faith shook her head, a new determination rising within her. No, I've spent 12 years running from memories, hiding from life. I won't run from my home, too. Before Martha could argue further, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, Faith could see a group of men on horseback riding down the street Hargrove's hired guns, led by the scarred man Forrest had described. I need to find Forrest, Faith said, rising quickly. Thank you, Martha, for everything. Martha hugged her tightly. Be careful, Faith, and know that not everyone in town stands with Hargrove. There are those of us who remember what Blackwater Creek was before he came and who would like to see it that way again. Faith slipped out the back way, keeping to side streets as she made her way toward the general store where she was to meet Forrest. The town seemed unusually quiet, with few people on the streets. Those who were out hurried along with heads down, avoiding eye contact. As she approached the store, Faith spotted Forrest already waiting, his posture tense as he scanned the street. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him, but it was short-lived. Behind him, the scarred gunman and 2 others were approaching, hands hovering near their weapons. Faith quickened her pace, desperate to reach Forrest before the confrontation she could see brewing. She was still half a block away when the scarred man called out, Finley, time's up. Boss wants an answer. Forrest turned slowly, his stance casual but his right hand dangerously close to his holster. Thought I had a week. The scarred man spat on the ground. Plans change? You're becoming a nuisance? Faith froze, caught in the open street between the 2 groups. Forrest saw her, his expression flashing from surprise to alarm. Faith, get inside the store, he called, not taking his eyes off the gunman. The scarred man turned, noticing Faith for the first time. A slow, cruel smile spread across his disfigured face. Well now, if it isn't Miss Vallance herself. Saves us a trip out to that miserable ranch of yours. Faith stood her ground, refusing to show fear. I have nothing to say to you or your employer, Mr. Willis. She recognized him now, Jed Willis, a notorious gunfighter who drifted into Blackwater Creek about a year ago and quickly found employment with Hargrove. Willis touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. It's not about what you have to say, madam. It's about what you're going to do. Sign that land over to Mr. Hargrove, right now, or watch your boyfriend die right here in the street. Forrest's voice cut through the tension. Faith, go inside. Now. Instead, Faith moved forward, placing herself between Forrest and the gunman. I will never sell to Victor Hargrove, not for any price, not under any threat. Willis's hand moved to his gun. That's a shame, Miss Vallance. Truly. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Willis drew, his movement lightning fast. But Forrest was faster, shoving Faith aside as he fired, his bullet striking Willis in the shoulder. The gunman's shot went wild, shattering the store window behind them. The street erupted in gunfire. Forrest pushed Faith toward the cover of a water trough, returning fire as he moved. One of Willis's men fell, clutching his chest. The other retreated behind a hitching post, firing wildly. Faith watched in horror as Forrest exchanged shots with the remaining gunman. He was good better than she'd imagined, but he was outnumbered. And then she saw movement from the roof of the hotel across the street, another gunman, taking aim at Forrest's exposed back. Forrest, above you, she screamed, lunging for the fallen gunman's weapon. Forrest spun, firing upward just as the rooftop shooter squeezed his trigger. Both men fired simultaneously. The shooter toppled from the roof, but Forrest staggered, a red stain blossoming on his left side. Faith raised the gun she'd retrieved, firing at Willis as he emerged from cover. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to force him back into hiding. She scrambled to Forrest's side, helping him behind the dubious shelter of the water trough. "You're hit!" she gasped, pressing her hand to his wound. Forrest grimaced. "Just grazed, but we need to get out of here." He peered around the trough. "The livery stable. If we can reach our horses—" A new volley of gunfire cut him off, bullets splintering the wood above their heads. Faith ducked, her heart pounding in her ears. This was it, she realized. They were going to die here, in the middle of Blackwater Creek, all because Victor Hargrove wanted her land. Then, miraculously, answering gunfire came from behind them. Faith risked a glance and saw Frank Miller and several other townspeople emerging from buildings, rifles aimed at Willis and his remaining man. "That's enough, Willis," Miller shouted. "This isn't your private shooting gallery," Willis cursed, recognizing the shift in odds. "This ain't over, Finley," he called, before he and his remaining man retreated, disappearing down an alley. Miller approached cautiously, rifle still ready. "You two all right?" Forrest nodded, pressing a handkerchief to his side. "Thanks to you. Didn't expect reinforcements." Miller offered a grim smile. "Hargrove may own the town, but he doesn't own everyone in it. Martha Hayes spread the word about what was happening. Some of us decided it was time to take a stand." Faith looked at the gathered townspeople, the blacksmith, the school teacher, ordinary men and women who'd risked their lives to help them. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you." Miller helped Forrest to his feet. "You need to get that wound seen to. And then you both need to get out of town. Willis and his men will be back with more guns next time." Forrest exchanged a look with Faith. "We're not running." "Figured you'd say that." Miller sighed. "In that case, you'd better come with me. We need to talk strategy." Miller led them to his small ranch north of town, where his wife Sarah tended to Forrest's wound, a deep graze that had bled freely but wasn't life-threatening. Around the kitchen table, Miller explained the situation in Blackwater Creek. Hargrove's been buying up land for years. Ever since he got wind of the railroad plans, Miller said, pouring coffee for everyone. Most folks sold willingly enough he offered fair prices at first, but as time went on and the holdouts remained, his methods got rougher. "Like what happened to Martha's husband?" Faith asked quietly. Miller nodded grimly. "Jacob Hayes's death was no accident. He refused to sell a parcel of land that bordered the proposed rail line. A week later, he was crushed by a falling tree while clearing brush." He shook his head. "No one could prove anything, of course." "And the law does nothing?" Forrest asked, wincing as he shifted in his chair. "Sheriff Davies is in Hargrove's pocket," Miller replied. "Has been for years, but there's a circuit judge due in town next week. Honest man, from what I hear. If we can hold out until then, present evidence of Hargrove's crimes." Faith frowned. "What evidence? Everyone knows what he's doing, but proving it is another matter." "That's where I might be able to help," Sarah Miller interjected. She'd been quiet until now, listening as she prepared a meal. "My sister works as a cook at Hargrove House. She's seen documents, heard conversations, things that could incriminate him." Hope flickered in Faith's chest. "Would she testify?" "For the right cause," Sarah said, meeting Faith's gaze. "To stop more people from ending up like Jacob Hayes? Yes, I believe she would." Forrest leaned forward, his eyes intense. "So we gather evidence, present it to the judge, and hope he acts before Hargrove makes another move against us." "That's the idea," Miller confirmed. "But you'll need to stay out of sight until then. Willis and his men will be looking for you both." Faith reached for Forrest's hand under the table, finding strength in his solid presence. "We can go back to the ranch. It's defensible, and they won't expect us to return there so soon." Miller looked doubtful. "It's isolated. If they find you there—" "We'll be ready," Forrest said with quiet confidence. "And we won't be alone, will we?" Miller's weathered face broke into a slow smile. "No, you won't. There are more people in Blackwater Creek willing to stand against Hargrove than he realizes. We've just been waiting for the right moment and the right cause." That night, under cover of darkness, Forrest and Faith returned to the Vallance homestead, accompanied by Miller and 2 other men. They worked through the night, fortifying the house, setting up defensive positions, preparing for the siege they all knew was coming. In the quiet hours before dawn, Faith found Forrest on the porch, staring out at the land that had become the center of this conflict. His wound had been properly dressed, but he moved stiffly, favoring his injured side. "You should be resting," she said, joining him at the railing. Forrest glanced at her, his expression softening. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." Faith understood. The day had changed everything, revealed enemies, uncovered allies, and forced them both to confront the reality of their situation. They were at war with the most powerful man in the county, with only a handful of supporters and the promise of justice that might come too late. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. Forrest considered the question. "Not of dying. I've faced that possibility too many times to fear it anymore." He turned to her, his eyes serious in the moonlight. "But I'm afraid of failing you. Again." Faith moved closer, her hand finding his on the railing. "You didn't fail me, Forrest. We were young. We wanted different things." "And now?" he asked, his voice low. "What do you want now, Faith?" She looked out at the land, her heritage, her burden, and her pride. Then she looked back at the man beside her. The boy she'd loved, who had returned as a man, she was rapidly falling in love with all over again. "I want to keep my home," she said honestly, "and I want you to stay. Not because you feel obligated or guilty, or because you need to protect me, but because you want to. Because this could be your home too." Forrest turned fully to face her, lifting her chin with gentle fingers. "I want to stay," he said simply. "I've spent 12 years wandering, Faith, never finding what I was looking for. Because what I was looking for was right here all along." He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that held promise, redemption, and the whisper of a future neither had dared to imagine until now. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation and vigilance. True to Miller's word, supporters arrived, men and women from town and surrounding farms, who had their own reasons to oppose Victor Hargrove. They brought food, ammunition, and information. Hargrove was rallying his forces, they reported. Willis had been seen recruiting additional gunmen from neighboring counties. The confrontation was coming. On the 6th day, a rider approached the ranch at dawn, not one of Hargrove's men, but Martha Hayes, her face pale with urgency. "They're coming," she gasped as Forrest helped her from her horse. "Hargrove, Willis, at least 15 gunmen. They left town an hour ago." Forrest nodded grimly. "We're ready for them?" He turned to Faith. "Get everyone to their positions. I'll take the barn with Miller and his men." Faith caught his arm before he could leave. "Be careful." He kissed her quickly. "Always am." The defenders took their places, Forrest and Miller's group in the barn, which offered a clear view of the approaching road. Faith and several others in the house, covering the flanks and rear. 2 men hidden in a gully to the east, positioned to warn of any attempt to circle around. They didn't have to wait long. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced the approaching riders. Forrest counted 16 men as they came into view, with Hargrove himself riding in the middle, Willis at his side. The riders stopped just beyond rifle range, and Hargrove urged his horse forward a few paces. "Faith Vallance," he called, his voice carrying across the yard. "This is your last chance. Sign over the deed, and you and your friends can leave unharmed. Refuse, and I cannot be responsible for what happens next." Faith stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "This land is not for sale, Victor. Not today, not ever. The circuit judge arrives tomorrow. He'll be very interested to hear about your business practices." Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "You think a judge will help you? By the time he arrives, there will be nothing left of this place but ashes." He wheeled his horse around, retreating to his men. A moment later, the attack began. The gunmen split into 3 groups, approaching from different directions. Gunfire erupted from all sides, bullets thudding into wood and shattering windows. Forrest and Miller's men returned fire from the barn, forcing the main group to seek cover behind rocks and trees. Faith coordinated the defense of the house, moving from window to window, firing when she had a clear shot. The air grew thick with gun smoke and the acrid smell of spent powder. For an hour the battle raged, neither side gaining a clear advantage. 2 of Hargrove's men lay motionless in the open, and another had been helped to cover, clearly wounded. On the defenders' side, one man had taken a bullet to the arm, but remained at his post. Then, during a lull in the firing, Forrest spotted movement at the edge of the property. 3 of Hargrove's men had circled around and were approaching the barn from behind. They carried something that glinted in the sunlight: kerosene cans. "They're going to burn us out," Forrest shouted to Miller. "Cover me!" Before Miller could stop him, Forrest slipped out the back door of the barn, staying low as he moved toward the approaching men. Miller and his companions provided covering fire, forcing the would-be arsonists to dive for cover. Forrest reached a water trough, using it as shelter as he took aim. His first shot struck one of the kerosene cans, the liquid igniting in a flash of flame that engulfed the man carrying it. The other 2 retreated, firing blindly behind them. The tide of battle seemed to be turning in their favor when a shout from the house caught Forrest's attention. He turned to see smoke rising from the back of the structure. Another group had managed to set fire to the rear of the house. "Faith!" Forrest abandoned his position, running toward the house as bullets kicked up dust around his feet. He burst through the front door to find Chaos defenders rushing to combat the fire that was already consuming the back bedroom, smoke filling the main room. "Faith!" he called again, coughing as smoke burned his lungs. "Here!" Her voice came from the kitchen, where she was organizing a bucket line to fight the fire. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair wild, but her eyes were clear and determined. "We need to get everyone out," Forrest said, grabbing her arm. "The fire's spreading too fast." Faith shook her head stubbornly. "I won't leave. This is my home, Forrest." "It's just a house," he argued, his voice urgent. "We can rebuild, but I can't lose you again." The naked emotion in his words reached her. Faith looked around at the home she'd fought so hard to protect, the walls that held her memories, the roof that had sheltered her family for 30 years. Then she looked back at Forrest and made her choice. "Everyone out the front," she called to the defenders. "The house is lost." They retreated to the barn, fighting their way through gunfire. Miraculously, everyone made it, though 2 more had suffered wounds in the process. From their new position, they watched as the Vallance homestead burned, flames reaching toward the sky in a final defiant blaze. Hargrove's men had ceased firing, watching the destruction with evident satisfaction. Hargrove himself sat his horse at the edge of the property, a triumphant smile on his fleshy face. "It's over, Faith," he called. "Your precious land is worthless now. Sell to me, and at least you'll have something to start over with." Faith stood in the barn doorway, Forrest at her side. Her home was gone, reduced to flames and smoke, but her land remained the earth beneath her feet, the soil her father had worked, the ground that held her family's bones. "Never," she called back, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "This land is mine. The law will decide what happens next." Hargrove's face darkened. "The law is whatever I say it is in Blackwater Creek." "Not anymore," a new voice called. All eyes turned to see a group of riders approaching from the direction of town, at least 20 men, led by a tall figure in a long coat. As they drew closer, Forrest recognized the U.S. Marshal's badge glinting on the leader's chest. "Marshal Thompson," Forrest breathed, relief washing over him. His telegram had reached its destination after all. Hargrove's men looked to their employer, uncertainty evident in their postures. Willis spurred his horse forward, whispering urgently in Hargrove's ear. The rancher's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating at the sight of federal authority. Marshal Thompson halted his men, a short distance from Hargrove's group. "Victor Hargrove," he called, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I have warrants for your arrest on charges of conspiracy, intimidation, and attempted murder. Surrender peacefully, and no one else needs to get hurt today." For a moment, it seemed Hargrove might resist. His hand moved toward the rifle in his saddle holster. Then, seeing the overwhelming odds against him, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "This isn't over," he muttered as 2 deputies moved to take him into custody. "The railroad won't be coming through Blackwater Creek after all," Thompson interrupted. "Seems they've found a more direct route 10 miles south. Your information was outdated, Hargrove." The revelation hit Hargrove like a physical blow. All his plotting, all his crimes for nothing. The land he'd coveted so desperately had never held the value he'd imagined. As Hargrove and his men were led away, Marshal Thompson approached Forrest and Faith, dismounting to shake Forrest's hand. "Got your telegram," he said. "Figured I'd bring some help, just in case." "Your timing couldn't have been better," Forrest replied, his arm around Faith's shoulders. "Though we've lost the house." Thompson surveyed the smoldering ruins. "Houses can be rebuilt. The important thing is, you're both alive." He turned to Faith. "Miss Vallance, I've heard a lot about you from this man. Seems like you're quite a woman." Faith managed a smile despite her tears. "I'm just someone who knows the value of home, Marshal." The aftermath of the battle brought changes to Blackwater Creek, with evidence provided by Sarah Miller's sister and testimony from Martha Hayes and others. Victor Hargrove faced justice not only for his actions against Faith, but for years of corruption and violence. Jed Willis and several other gunmen received prison sentences. The town began the slow process of healing, of reclaiming its identity from the shadow Hargrove had cast for so long. For Faith and Forrest, life took a new direction. The house was gone, but the land remained, and on that land, they began to build something new. Not just a home, but a future together. One evening, as they sat on the newly constructed porch of their half-built house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Faith turned to Forrest. "Do you ever regret coming back?" she asked. "When I think of all you've been through because of me?" Forrest silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. "Not for a single moment. Coming back to you was the best decision I ever made." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small object that gleamed in the fading light, a simple gold ring. "I should have given you this 12 years ago." Faith's breath caught as he slid from the porch swing to one knee before her. "Faith Vallance," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I left once because I thought I needed to find myself out there, in the wild places. But everything I was looking for, everything I needed, was right here all along. Will you marry me? Let me spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost?" Tears welled in Faith's eyes as she extended her hand. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Forrest Finley. I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to kiss her as the last rays of sunlight gilded the land around them, their home, the foundation of their future together. The wedding took place the following spring, when wildflowers carpeted the plains and the new house stood complete. The entire town turned out to celebrate. The ceremony held under the same oak tree where they had shared their first kiss as teenagers. As Forrest waited for his bride, Frank Miller approached, clapping him on the shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day," Miller said with a grin. The infamous Forrest Finley settling down. Forrest smiled, adjusting his new suit. "Neither did I. But life has a way of bringing you full circle, back to where you belong." When Faith appeared, walking toward him in a gown of ivory lace, a crown of wildflowers in her golden hair, Forrest felt his heart swell with a love so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. This was what he'd been searching for all those years on the trail, not adventure or fortune, but this woman, this land, this sense of belonging. As she reached him, Forrest removed his hat, the same weathered Stetson he'd worn when he first returned, and placed it gently over her head, an echo of the gesture that had once been part of their youthful courtship ritual. Faith smiled up at him from beneath the brim, her eyes shining with love and the promise of the years to come. "I'm home," he whispered as he took her hand to lead her the final steps to where the preacher waited. "We both are," she replied, squeezing his fingers. "Finally." And as they spoke their vows beneath the spreading oak, with friends and neighbors gathered around them and the vast Montana sky above, Forrest and Faith Finley embraced not just each other, but the future they would build together on the land that had brought them full circle from young love to separation, to a reunion that had tested their courage and proven the endurance of their hearts. In the years that followed, the Finley ranch prospered. 2 children joined their family, a son with Forrest's determined spirit, and a daughter with Faith's quiet strength. Blackwater Creek grew and changed, the shadow of Victor Hargrove's influence fading with time. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done, Forrest and Faith would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, their hands intertwined, their hearts full, and Forrest would think of the long, winding trail that had led him away from this place and then back again, of the lessons learned, the hardships endured, and the love that had waited, steadfast as the mountains on the horizon, for his return. He had placed his hat over her and led her home, and in doing so, he had found his own way home at last.